In the bitter waters of the Norse fjords, where ancient monsters swim beneath the ice, and warriors test their mettle against the fury of the sea, a man's worth is measured by the courage in his heart. For Eirik Thorvaldsson, that measure was found wanting. Cast overboard by his own warband during a storm, branded a coward when he begged them to turn back from certain death, he should have drowned in those merciless waters. Instead, fate had other plans. Washed ashore on a desolate fjord, he found salvation in the teachings of an outcast skald who knew the forbidden art of bone forging. Now, wielding a blade crafted from the bones of the deep, Eirik hunts the very monsters his former brothers fled from. But can a man truly forge a new destiny from the wreckage of his old life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wolf-emblazoned banner snapped in the bitter wind. It's red, fabric dark with spray, as the longship crested another wave. Eirik Thorvaldsson gripped the gunwale, his weathered hands white-knuckled against the rough wood. Above, storm clouds gathered like bruises in the evening sky, and the air carried the metallic taste of approaching thunder. Sogn Fjord lies ahead, called Bjorn Blacktooth from the stern, his voice carrying over the growing wind. The warband leader stood with his legs braced wide, one hand on the steering oar, the other gesturing toward the narrow channel ahead. "We'll catch those merchant ships in the narrows, where they can't escape." Eirik studied the waters ahead, noting how the waves grew more confused where they met the current flowing from the fjord. 20 years at sea had taught him to read. Water like other men read runes, and what he saw made his stomach clench. The tide was wrong. The wind was shifting. Nature itself seemed to warn against entering the fjord's mouth in such weather. He made his way aft, careful to keep his balance as the ship pitched beneath him. "Bjorn," he said, keeping his voice low so only the leader would hear, "the storm is worsening. We should seek shelter in one of the outer bays until it passes." Bjorn's scarred face twisted into a sneer. "Getting soft in your old age, Eirik. The merchants will use this storm as cover to slip past us. This is our chance to take them. The men are tired. We've been at sea for 6 days straight. If we push into the fjord now, the men are warriors." Bjorn spat, "Not fishwives to be coddled. Each of them swore oaths to follow my commands, including you." He leaned closer, his breath hot against Eirik's face. "Or have you forgotten your oath?" "Oath, brother?" The words stung like a slap. Of course Eirik remembered. 15 years ago he and Bjorn had cut their palms and clasped hands, mixing their blood as they swore to stand together, to fight together, to die together if the Norns decreed it. They had been young then, flush with victory after their first raid, drunk on mead and glory. But they were no longer young men, and glory meant something different now. Eirik thought of his wife, waiting in their steading with their 2 young sons. He thought of the other men's families, of the children who might be orphaned if the sea took them. Thunder cracked overhead, and the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. The waves were growing higher, their crests whipped into foam by the strengthening wind. In the distance, lightning illuminated the fjord's cliffs, stark and unforgiving. "Listen to me," Eirik tried again, gripping Bjorn's arm. "This isn't about courage. It's about wisdom. Even the bravest warrior knows when to—" "Enough!" Bjorn shoved him away. "Men, your oath brother thinks we should turn tail and run from a little rain. What say you to that?" The crew had gathered closer, drawn by their leader's argument. Eirik saw doubt in some faces, but also the fear of shame. No one wanted to be the first to agree with caution, to risk being branded a coward. "We press on!" shouted Harold Grimson, always eager to prove himself. Others took up the cry, their voices rising with the wind. Eirik felt the moment slipping away from him. He looked at the men he had fought beside, feasted beside, bled beside. "Brothers," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "there is no dishonor in respecting the sea's power. If we enter that fjord now, some of us will not return to our families." The word coward came first as a whisper, then grew louder as it passed from mouth to mouth. Eirik saw the change come over Bjorn's face, something cold and terrible replacing the brotherhood of years. "You speak of dishonor." Bjorn's voice cut through the wind. "You, who would have us shame ourselves before the merchants we hunt, before the gods themselves." He raised his voice to address the crew. "See how fear has rotted his heart. See how he would poison our courage with his cowardice." The ship pitched violently as they entered the fjord proper, where the winds were funneled between the cliffs. Water crashed over the bow, and men scrambled to keep their footing. Eric's hand went to the Thor's hammer that hung at his neck, a gift from his eldest son on the day of his first hunt. "Bjorn, please," he made. "One final attempt. If not for my sake, then for the sake of our oath. Don't do this." But there was no mercy in Bjorn's eyes, only the cold calculation of a man choosing his path. "You're right about one thing, Oath Brother. Some of us will not return from this fjord." The attack came so suddenly that Eirik had no chance to defend himself. Hands seized him from behind, Harold and two others, men he had once trusted with his life. Bjorn stepped forward, drawing his knife, and for a moment Eirik thought his old friend meant to cut his throat then and there. Instead, Bjorn grabbed the Thor's hammer pendant and sliced through its cord. "You are no brother of ours," he declared, his words carrying the weight of judgment. "The sea will decide if you deserve to carry a warrior's mark." Eirik struggled, but more hands joined the effort, lifting him toward the gunwale. The last thing he saw before they threw him into the raging sea was his pendant dangling from Bjorn's fist, spinning in the wind like a hanged man's dance. The water hit him like a hammer, driving the breath from his lungs. As he sank into the dark waters of the fjord, the ship already disappearing into the storm above, Eirik's last thought was not of anger or fear, but of profound sadness for oaths broken and brotherhood betrayed. Cold, a cold so deep it burned through muscle and bone, through memory and thought, until there was nothing left but the primal need to breathe. Eirik clawed his way toward what he hoped was the surface, lungs screaming for air. The storm-churned waters spun him like a leaf in an autumn wind, and for a moment he lost all sense of up and down. His head broke the surface just long enough to gasp one desperate breath before another wave drove him under. In that brief moment, he saw no sign of the longship. Perhaps they had already passed deeper into the fjord, or perhaps the storm had claimed them as it sought to claim him. The thought brought him no satisfaction. Something solid struck his shoulder, a piece of driftwood, he realized, probably torn from some unfortunate vessel's deck. Eirik seized it, using the oar-shaped timber to help keep his head above water. Years of seamanship took over, teaching him to work with the waves rather than fight them directly. Each time he surfaced, he searched the iron-grey skies for landmarks, trying to orient himself in the chaos. The cliffs of the fjord loomed like dark giants through the rain and spray, offering no shelter from the storm's fury. Lightning split the sky, and in its brief illumination, Eirik saw something that made his blood run colder than the sea itself. A vast shape moving beneath the waves, longer than any serpent had right to be. Tales were told in every port and fishing village of the monsters that dwelt in the deep fjords. Eirik had always half believed them, but belief was one thing, seeing was another. The creature's shadow passed beneath him, vast coils undulating with terrible grace. He held perfectly still, knowing that movement might draw its attention. The driftwood oar was his only weapon, and against such a beast, it might as well have been a child's toy. Another flash of lightning revealed the creature's head, breaking the surface perhaps 50 yards away, a skull-like visage with eyes that gleamed like glacial ice, and teeth that could have sheared a whale in half. The monster's gaze swept the waters, searching. Eirik forced himself to remain motionless, letting the waves rock him naturally. An old fisherman had once told him that the great beasts of the deep were drawn to the thrashing of wounded prey. Right now, that wisdom might be all that stood between him and a horrible death. For what seemed like an eternity, predator and prey remained suspended in their deadly dance. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature slipped beneath the waves. Eric watched its shadow pass beneath him once more, moving deeper into the fjord, perhaps following the longship that had cast him out. He offered no prayer for his former brother's safety. Let the gods and monsters sort out their fates. His only duty now was to survive. The storm showed no sign of weakening, but Eric's seaman's instincts told him the current was pulling him toward the fjord's eastern shore. He worked with it, using the driftwood oar to guide his drift while conserving his strength. The cold was his greatest enemy now. Even the hardiest Norseman could not survive long in these waters. Hours passed in a blur of wave and wind and numbing cold. Twice more he glimpsed mysterious shapes moving in the deep, but whether they were the same creature or others of its kind he could not tell. His world narrowed to the rhythm of survival. Keep holding the oar, keep breathing, keep moving enough to fight off the deadly sleep that cold waters brought. The first sign of hope came with a change in the sound of the waves. The distinct slap of water against a rocky shore. Eric forced his nearly frozen body to turn toward the sound. Through the rain, he could make out a strip of beach, dark against the lighter grey of the cliffs behind it. Getting to shore proved almost as challenging as surviving the open water. The waves here were treacherous, threatening to dash him against half-hidden rocks. Twice, he nearly lost his grip on the driftwood oar that had become his lifeline. But slowly, painfully, he worked his way closer to land. His feet touched bottom in a surge of relief so profound it nearly overwhelmed him. Staggering, stumbling, he pulled himself up onto the narrow beach. His legs gave way, and he fell to his knees in the coarse sand, still clutching the oar that had helped save his life. It was then that he noticed something strange about the beach. Mixed with the normal stones and seaweed were fragments of bone, huge bones, larger than any whale or walrus he had ever seen. They were old, smooth with age and sea wear, and marked with strange patterns that might have been natural decay, or might have been runes of a sort he had never encountered. Eric picked up one of the smaller pieces, studying it through exhausted eyes. The bone was dense and heavy, yet somehow not quite like any bone he knew. It thrummed faintly against his palm, as if remembering the life that had once filled it. A movement caught his eye, something sliding beneath the surface where the deeper waters met the shore. For a moment, he glimpsed that same glacial blue gaze he had seen earlier, watching him with ancient intelligence. Then it was gone, leaving him alone on the beach with nothing but questions and the driftwood oar that had carried him to safety. Using the oar as a staff, Eric pushed himself to his feet. He needed to find shelter before exposure claimed the life that the sea had spared. But as he turned to leave the beach, he took one last look at the bone fragment in his hand. Something told him these remains were important, that fate or the gods had brought him to this particular shore for a reason. He tucked the bone into his belt pouch, keeping the driftwood oar as both walking staff and weapon. Then, leaving wet footprints in the sand among the ancient bones, Eric began the long walk up the beach, searching for any sign of shelter in this desolate place where monsters swam and old bones whispered of forgotten powers. The smoke caught his attention first, a thin grey line rising against the cliffs, almost invisible in the storm's gloom. Eric changed course toward it, though his legs trembled with each step. The driftwood oar left deep tracks in the wet sand behind him, marking his unsteady progress. As he drew closer, the source of the smoke revealed itself, a dwelling built into the very face of the cliff. Old ships' timbers formed the walls, their wood silvered with age and worn smooth by countless storms. Runes were carved deep into every beam, glowing faintly with a light that seemed to come from within the wood itself. Before Eric could reach the door, it swung open. A figure emerged, tall and straight-backed despite obvious age, with hair white as seafoam and eyes that seemed to hold the same ancient wisdom as the deep waters themselves. She wore a cloak of seal skin and carried a staff carved with spiraling patterns that made his eyes hurt if he looked at them too long. "I have been waiting for you, Eirik Thorvaldsen," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the wind. The bones spoke of your coming. He stopped, grip tightening on the driftwood oar. How do you know my name? The old woman smiled, though there was something sharp and dangerous in the expression. I am Grida, and knowing is my trade. Come inside before the cold claims you, unless you prefer to join the bones on my beach. Eric glanced back at the shore where he had washed up. From this angle, he could see that what he had taken for random scatter was actually a pattern. The bones laid out in precise lines and curves that suggested purpose rather than chance. Inside, the dwelling was larger than it appeared from without, extending deep into the cliff face. A fire burned in a hearth carved from the living rock, and all around the walls stood shelves lined with books. Actual books, their leather bindings worn and cracking with age. Such a treasure would have bought a king's ransom, yet here they sat in this hidden place, gathering salt and sea spray. Strip off those wet clothes before you die of exposure, Grida commanded, moving to a chest near the fire. She withdrew a bundle of cloth and tossed it to him. These will fit well enough. The dry clothes were rough spun but warm, and Eric's mind began to clear as his body slowly thawed. Grida pressed a cup of something hot into his hands, not mead or ale, but something that tasted of herbs and secrets. Why did you say you were waiting for me? He asked finally, watching as she moved about the room, gathering items from various shelves. Instead of answering directly, she placed an ancient tome on the table before him. Its cover was pale and smooth, and with a shock, he realized it was made of bone. Do you know what this is, castaway? A book of secrets by its look. The Boneforger's tome, she corrected, the last of its kind, containing knowledge that the wise ones of old decided was too dangerous to preserve. Knowledge of how to take the bones of great beasts and shape them into weapons of power. She opened it carefully, revealing pages covered in script that seemed to shift and change as he watched. Knowledge that you will need if you are to survive. What comes next? Eric set down his cup. I am no skald or sorcerer. I was a warrior. You were a warrior who chose wisdom over glory and nearly died for it. Grida's eyes seemed to pierce through him. Tell me, Eirik Thorvaldsson, what did you see in the waters of the fjord? What watched you with ancient eyes and decided to let you live? He remembered that glacial gaze, the sense of being measured by something older than mankind. There are monsters in these waters. There are monsters everywhere, Grida replied. In the deep waters, yes, but also in the hearts of men who cast their brothers aside for asking inconvenient truths. She tapped the bone-bound tome. The question is, what will you do about it? Why should I do anything? Let them reap what they've sown. Grida's laugh was like ice cracking. Do you think your former brother's betrayal was simple happenstance? The monsters of the deep have agents among men, those they've corrupted with promises of power and glory. Your warband sails now to serve powers they don't understand, and their actions will bring doom to more than just themselves. Eirik thought of his sons, of the coastal villages where innocent families lived. If what Grida said was true, what would you have me do? Learn. She opened the tome wider, revealing diagrams of weapons unlike any he had seen. Learn the old ways, the true ways. Learn how to take the bones of these creatures and forge them into weapons that can pierce their hides and break their power. Learn why the ancient ones first developed these arts and why they were later forbidden. She pulled something from her robes, the fragment of bone he had found on the beach, the one he thought safely stored in his belt pouch. You were drawn to this for a reason. The old powers recognized their own. Eric stared at the bone fragment, feeling again that strange, thrumming energy. How long would this learning take? As long as necessary. Time moves strangely here, in this place between sea and stone. Grida's expression grew serious. But know this, the path of the bone forger is not an easy one. The weapons we create carry a price, both in their making and their wielding. Are you prepared to pay it? Through the dwelling's open door, Eric could see the storm still raging over the fjord. Somewhere out there, his former brothers sailed, in service to monsters, threatening all he had once sworn to protect. He thought of the driftwood oar that had saved him, now leaning against Grida's wall, a simple tool that had granted him a second chance at life. "Teach me," he said finally. "Teach me everything. The sea speaks to those who know how to listen," Grida said, her voice carrying over the pre-dawn winds. "Every wave, every current tells a story. Today they speak of something vast moving through the depths." Eric stood at the water's edge, feeling the cold foam wash over his boots. 3 months of study had changed him. His beard had grown longer, streaked with more grey than before, and his eyes had taken on some of the sharp intensity he'd seen in Grida's gaze. The bone forger's tome had filled his dreams with ancient knowledge, and his hands bore new scars from practicing the art of bone working. "There," he said, pointing to where the waves formed an unusual pattern. "The water's moving against the tide." Grida nodded approvingly. "Your eyes are learning. What else do you see?" Eric studied the waters carefully, applying his years of seamanship to this new purpose. "The seabirds are avoiding that area, and there's a deep water swell that doesn't match the others." He turned to his teacher. "It's hunting." "Yes, a young one by the signs, not yet fully grown into its power." She handed him a harpoon, unlike any he'd ever seen. The shaft was ordinary enough, good ash wood, well seasoned, but the head was carved from bone, covered in runes that pulsed. With a faint cold light, "Remember what you've learned. The weapons of men cannot pierce their hide, but bone remembers bone. The flesh remembers the flesh it once was." Eric tested the harpoon's weight, feeling that now familiar thrum of power in the bone tip. "And if I fail, then I'll add your bones to my collection," Grida said with her ice-crack laugh. "But you won't fail. The sea didn't spare you just to feed you to the first hunter you meet." They pushed out in Grida's boat, a small craft that seemed to glide through the waves like a living thing. Its hull was inscribed with runes, similar to those on her house, and the water seemed to part before its bow. Eric took the oars, the same movements he'd made 10,000 times now, serving a different purpose. They didn't have to wait long. The first sign was a shadow passing beneath them, vast and silent. Eric felt the creature's presence in his bones, a deep thrumming that matched the frequency of the harpoon in his hands. The boat rocked gently as the monster circled them, sizing up its prey. "It's larger than you said," he muttered, watching the shadow pass again. "Size matters less than skill," Grida replied calmly. "Remember, they're clever. It's testing us, learning our movements. When it surfaces, it will expect fear. It will expect us to behave like prey." The shadow disappeared into deeper water. Seconds stretched into minutes. Eric kept his breathing steady, just as Grida had taught him. The harpoon's bone tip grew colder in his hands, responding to its kindred's presence. The attack came with explosive force. The creature burst from the water 30 feet away, its serpentine body rising like a dark tower. In the grey morning light, Eric saw the same skull-like head he'd glimpsed during the storm, but now he could see it clearly. Ridged bone plates, eyes like frozen pools, teeth that could shear through ship's timbers. Time seemed to slow. All of Grida's lessons crystallized in his mind, the creature's attack pattern, its vulnerable spots, the way its own momentum could be used against it. The bone-forged harpoon hummed in his hands, eager for its purpose. Eric waited until the monster committed to its strike, its massive head plunging toward their boat. At the last possible moment, he thrust the harpoon upward, putting all his strength behind it. The bone tip struck just behind the creature's jaw, where the armored plates were thinnest. The monster's shriek shook the air itself, instead of bouncing. Off like normal weapons would, the bone tip sank deep, its runes flaring with cold fire. The creature thrashed, trying to pull away, but Eric held firm to the harpoon shaft, letting the monster's own strength drive the weapon deeper. "Now!" Grida's voice cut through the chaos. "Speak the words!" Eric recalled the runes from the bone forger's tome, his voice rising in the ancient language of power. The harpoon's glow intensified, spreading like ice through the creature's flesh. Its struggles weakened, its movements becoming jerky and uncoordinated. With a final, earth-shaking cry, the monster collapsed into the waves. The water around them turned dark with its blood, not red, but a deep midnight blue that seemed to hold shadows within it. "Well struck," Grida said, already preparing the ropes and hooks they would need. "Now comes the true test of a bone forger's skill. This beast will provide the material for your real weapons if you can harvest it correctly." They worked through the morning and into the afternoon, using Grida's enchanted ropes to secure the carcass and begin the careful process of harvesting what they needed. The creature's rib cage was a cathedral of bone, each rib larger than a ship's mast. But it was one particular rib, curved like a sword and humming with latent power, that caught Eric's attention. "Yes," Grida said, seeing where his gaze had settled. "That's the one. You feel it, don't you? The bone calls to its wielder." Eric reached out to touch the massive rib. The moment his fingers made contact, he felt a connection, like recognition, like destiny. This was what he had been preparing for. This bone would become his weapon, his tool for justice against both monsters and the men who served them. As they worked to free the chosen rib, Eric glanced at the creature's open eyes, now glazed in death. He remembered how those eyes had watched him during the storm, measuring him, perhaps even marking him for this moment. "Why did it let me live that night?" he asked Grida. "It could have taken me easily." The old woman was quiet for a long moment, her hands never stopping their work. "Perhaps it saw in you something worth preserving, or perhaps the old powers simply have a sense of irony, letting you live so you could learn to kill them." She smiled her sharp smile. "Does it matter? You survived, you learned, and now you've taken your first step toward becoming what you need to be." Eric looked at the massive rib that would soon become his weapon, then at the dark waters of the Fjord stretching to the horizon. Somewhere out there, Bjorn and the others still sailed, serving the monsters that ruled these waters. They thought they had sentenced him to death that night in the storm. Instead, they had set him on the path to becoming their doom. "Blood calls to blood," Grida said, laying out the tools of bone forging on a table of age-darkened wood. "Flesh remembers flesh. To forge a weapon from the bones of the deep, you must give something of yourself in return." The massive rib bone lay before them, cleaned and prepared through 3 days of ritual. Eric had learned that bone forging was nothing like normal weapon making. Each step required precise timing, specific incantations, and often a physical sacrifice from the forger themselves. "The old ones understood the balance," Grida continued, opening the bone forger's tome to a page marked with symbols that seemed to writhe on the parchment. "Power must be paid for. The greater the weapon, the greater the price." The bone gleamed in the firelight, already humming with potential. At nearly 6 feet in length, curved like a sword from some giant's armory, it would make a fearsome blade. But first, it had to be shaped, enchanted, awakened to its new purpose. "Your blood will bind it," Grida explained, handing him a knife carved from whale ivory. "Your pain will shape it. Your memories will wake it. Are you prepared for this?" Eric took the knife, studying its worn handle and the runes etched along its blade. "What aren't you telling me?" The old woman's smile held respect for his perception. "The price is more than physical. To forge a weapon of true power, you must give it something of your soul, a memory, a piece of who you are, something you're willing to sacrifice forever. Forever. The weapon will consume it, use it as part of its power. You'll remember that it happened, but the feeling, the emotional truth of it, that will belong to the blade." Eric considered this. "And I choose which memory. Choose carefully. The memory must have power, joy or pain, triumph or loss. The stronger the emotion, the stronger the blade." She paused, watching him intently. "Many choose memories of pain or betrayal, thinking to rid themselves of hurt. But joy has its own power, and its loss can leave a deeper wound." The fire crackled in the hearth as Eric contemplated his choice. He had many memories that might serve. Victories in battle, moments of brotherhood now turned bitter, the birth of his sons, the betrayal that had brought him here. Finally, he nodded. "I'm ready." The ritual began at midnight, when the tide was highest. They carried the bone and their tools to the beach, setting up beneath the stars. Grida had drawn a complex circle of runes in the sand, their lines glowing with that same inner light he'd seen in the runes on her house. Following her instructions, Eric placed the bone in the center of the circle. The ivory knife felt cold in his hand as he knelt beside it. Above them, the aurora danced across the sky, casting shifting colors over the fjord. "Begin with blood," Grida instructed, her voice taking on a rhythmic quality. "Let it flow from your heart hand into the grooves I showed you to cut." Eric drew the knife across his left palm, letting his blood drip onto the bone. Where it touched, it seemed to sink in, leaving traces like frost on a window pane. The bone's humming grew stronger, resonating with his own heartbeat. "Now the shaping," Grida continued. "Focus your will through the pain. See the weapon it must become." Hours passed as Eric worked, shaping the bone not with physical tools, but with will and blood and pain. The aurora's light seemed to flow into the bone, making it glow from within. His hands burned with cold fire as he worked, but he didn't stop. Gradually, the massive rib began to change, becoming smoother, sharper, more deadly. "The memory," Grida said finally, her voice distant. "Give it now, before the forge time passes." Eric closed his eyes, calling up the memory he had chosen, his eldest son's first successful hunt. The pride and joy that had filled him as the boy brought down a deer with a perfect shot. The way his son had smiled, fierce and proud, and so full of love. The embrace they had shared, father and son, hunter and hunter. He felt the memory begin to fade, not like normal forgetting, but like water draining from a cup. The facts remained. He knew it had happened, could recall the sequence of events, but the emotions, the pure joy of that moment, were drawn into the bone beneath his hands. The blade began to shine with a light like sunrise, and for a moment he felt his son's love and pride flowing through the weapon, becoming part of its power. Then it was done. Where there had been a massive rib bone, there was now a sword unlike any ever seen in the northern lands. Nearly as tall as a man, it curved like a wave about to break, its edge sharp enough to split a hair. The bone had become translucent, like ice with deep waters moving within it. Runes glowed along its length, some that Grida had taught him, others that had formed themselves during the forging. "Take it," Grida said softly. "Complete the binding." Eric gripped the handle, wrapped in leather and sealed with his own blood. The blade recognized him instantly. He felt it like a chord struck in his soul. Power hummed through his arms, and the runes flared briefly before settling into a steady, subtle glow. "What do you feel?" Grida asked. "It's alive," Eric said wonderingly. "Not like a human life, but aware. I can feel it testing me, learning me. The blade will grow with you, learn with you. It will never serve another hand as well as yours." She looked at him seriously. "But remember the price you paid, that joy you gave it. The blade will use it against your enemies. They'll feel a father's love turned to a weapon, and it will break them." Eric swung the blade experimentally, marveling at how light it felt despite its size. It moved like it was part of him, responding to his thoughts as much as his muscles. The loss of the memory's emotion left an ache in his heart, but he could feel its power living on in the weapon. "Does it have a name?" he asked. "It feels like it should have a name." Grida shook her head. "Names have power. The blade will tell you its name when the time is right." She began gathering their tools. "For now, rest. Tomorrow we begin learning how to truly use what you've created." Eric stood on the beach long after Grida had returned to her dwelling, watching the aurora's light play along the blade's surface. The weapon seemed to drink in the celestial radiance, storing it like secrets in its translucent depths. He thought of Bjorn and his former brothers, of the monsters they served, of the vengeance he would take. The blade hummed in his hands, eager for its purpose. Dawn painted the fjord in shades of iron and pearl as Eric traced lines on his crude map, marking the patterns of monster sightings he'd gathered from weeks of observation. The parchment was weathered, its edges salt-stained, but the careful notations showed clear hunting territories and feeding grounds. 3 fishing boats lost in the past month alone, all in areas where the deep waters met the shallow shelves. "Your map grows more detailed," Grida observed, studying his work. "You see the patterns now?" "They're not random attacks," Eric replied, tapping specific points on the chart. "They're systematic. The creatures are herding the fishing boats away from certain areas." He traced a larger circle encompassing several marked locations. "Something in these waters they don't want found." "Good." Grida's approval was as rare as summer snow. "You're ready for your first solo hunt. Choose your ground carefully. The hunters can become the hunted if you pick the wrong battlefield." Eric ran his hand along the bone blade that now seemed as much a part of him as his own arm. The weapon had changed since its forging. The translucent surface, developing deeper layers like ice over ancient waters. Sometimes in the darkness, he swore he could see shadows moving within it, memories of its former life perhaps, or echoes of the joy he had sacrificed to wake it. He chose his hunting ground with the same care he had once used to select raiding targets, a narrow channel where the fjord's waters were constricted between underwater ridges. The depth charts in Grida's collection showed places where the sea floor rose suddenly, forcing even the largest creatures to navigate with care. The small boat he'd restored over the winter handled well, responding to his touch like a well-trained horse. He'd carved protective runes into its hull and sealed them with his blood, as Grida had taught him. Not enough to make it a true bone-forged vessel, but sufficient to mask its presence from the deeper hunters. He waited through the morning tide, watching the water's patterns with new understanding. The seabirds told him much, where they clustered, where they avoided, how they called to each other. By midday, he had his first confirmation, a shadow passing beneath his boat, vast but not as large as the creature he'd taken his blade from. "Come then," he whispered, feeling his weapon's eager humming. "Let's see what you've learned of fear since your kin began falling to bone-forged blades." The attack came faster than he expected, not from below, but from behind, the creature launching itself from the water like a breaching whale. Eirik spun, blade ready, as tons of scaled flesh crashed down toward his small craft. The bone weapons, runes flared with cold fire as he struck, opening a gash in the monster's armored hide that would have turned a normal blade. The creature's shriek echoed off the fjord's walls, but Eric noted it was different from the first one he'd hunted. Higher, almost bird-like. Each kind had its own voice, he'd learned, its own way of expressing pain and rage. What followed was a dance of death, unlike any battle he'd known before. The creature was younger, faster than his first kill, but he had grown into his new powers. Where once he had fought with just steel and strength, now he wielded a weapon that drank deep of ancient magic. The blade seemed to guide his hands, anticipating the monster's movements, finding weak points he hadn't consciously noticed. Blood, the color of midnight, stained the waves as they fought. The creature was clever, trying to draw him into deeper waters where its advantage would be greater. But Eirik had chosen his ground well. In the narrow channel, the monster couldn't bring its full mass to bear without risking collision with the underwater ridges. The killing stroke came when the beast tried to dive beneath his boat, probably intending to surface beneath and capsize him. Eirik timed his strike perfectly, driving the bone blade deep into the creature's skull as it passed. The weapon's runes blazed like captured aurora, and he felt the power pulse through his arms. His sacrificed joy turned to a weapon, filling the monster's dying mind with a father's love, twisted into killing force. As the massive body went limp, Eric noticed something he hadn't seen in his first hunt. Marks on the creature's hide that couldn't have been natural. Regular patterns, too precise to be scars from battle or rock scrapes. Someone, or something, had marked this beast, claimed it perhaps, or bound it to their will. He worked quickly to harvest what he needed, using Grida's teachings to identify the most potent bones for forging. The sun was setting by the time he finished, painting the fjord's waters in colors that reminded him of the monster's blood. Returning to the shore near Grida's dwelling, he found an unexpected sight. A small fishing boat pulled up on the beach, its crew waiting nervously on the sand. They shrank back as he approached, his blade and arms still stained with dark blood. But one man stepped forward. "Are you the one they speak of?" the fisherman asked. "The hunter who walks the bitter waters with a blade of bone?" Eric planted his weapon in the sand, studying them carefully. "What do they say of such a hunter? That he protects those who sail the fjords, that the deep ones fear him." The man's voice gained strength. "That he might help us if we asked. 2 boats we've lost this month, good men with them. There's something hunting our waters, something that's never been seen before." "A new kind of monster?" The fisherman shook his head. "Not new, old, very old by the tales. My grandfather told, it leaves marks on its victims, patterns cut into bone." Eric thought of the marks he'd seen on his kill today. "Tell me more." As the fishermen shared their story, Eric felt his weapon humming softly in the sand beside him. The blade had tasted blood today, had sung its song of death and ancient power. But this, he realized, was what he had truly been preparing for. Not just learning to kill monsters, but learning to protect those who could not protect themselves. The legend of the Bone Blade Hunter was spreading through the fjords, it seemed. Let it spread. Let the monsters learn to fear it, and let those who served them, those who had once been his brothers, hear the tales and know that their betrayal had forged something far deadlier than the warrior they had tried to drown. The mead hall was crowded with traders and fishermen seeking shelter from the autumn storm, their voices competing with the wind that howled through the eaves. A traveller sat near the central fire, his clothes still damp from the road. In his hands he held a curved horn decorated with intricate carvings, a storyteller's horn, marked with the signs that showed its bearer carried true tales rather than mere fantasy. 3 ships saved in a fortnight, the traveller was saying, his voice carrying the weight of personal witness. "I saw the aftermath with my own eyes. The monster's carcass washed up on the eastern shores, bigger than any whale, with a wound that went straight through its armored skull, clean through bone that could turn aside a dozen normal blades." The hall had grown quiet. Faces turned toward the stranger as he raised the horn to his lips and blew a single clear note that seemed to make the shadows deeper. "They say he comes out of the storm itself, his blade glowing like the aurora. A warrior they cast out, returned with powers drawn from the deep places of the world. The Bone Blade Hunter, they call him now." In a darker corner of the hall, a figure stirred. Harold Grimson, once of Bjorn Blacktooth's warband, leaned forward to listen more carefully. 6 months had passed since they'd thrown Eric overboard, and the memory still haunted his dreams. "What else do they say of this hunter?" Harold called out, trying to keep his voice steady. The traveller's eyes found him in the shadows. "They say he knows the monster's ways better than any living man, that he can read the waters like a skald reads runes, that his weapon was forged from the bones of the first great beast he killed, and that it drinks the monster's blood like mead." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. An old fisherman spoke up. "I heard tell he saved the Carlson brothers when that thing with the ice-blue eyes came for their boat. Cut clean through its neck, they said, and the water burned where its blood touched it." "Aye," another voice added. "And they say he's teaching others now. There's talk of more bone-forged weapons being seen in the northern fjords. Not as powerful as his, mind you, but enough to give the deep ones pause." Harold felt his hand tighten on his mead cup. He remembered Eric's last words before they cast him into the storm, his warnings about the tide, about the dangers that lurked in deep waters. At the time, they'd seemed the coward's excuses. Now, "But why does he hunt them?" someone asked. "What drives a man to face such monsters alone?" The traveller smiled, a knowing expression that suggested he held darker truths. "Some say revenge, though against whom none can say. Others claim he protects the fishing fleets out of simple duty. But there are whispers." He paused, letting the tension build. "Whispers that he knows something about these creatures that others don't. That he's hunting not just the monsters themselves, but those who control them." Harold stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his bench. He needed to get word to Bjorn. If Eirik had somehow survived, if he had gained such power. "You seem troubled, friend," the traveller called after him. "Perhaps you've heard other tales of the Boneblade Hunter?" Harold forced himself to stop, to turn slowly. "Just remembering old stories my grandmother told, of warriors who learned forbidden magics. It never ended well for them." "Ah, but those were tales of men who sought power for its own sake." The traveller raised his horn again. "This is a story of a man who had power thrust upon him by fate, or perhaps by the gods themselves. They say even the great beasts of the deep recognize him now, that some flee at his approach while others—" The stranger's eyes seemed to pierce Harold's soul. "Others seem almost to bow to him, as if they know something about him that we don't." Unable to bear that knowing gaze, Harold fled into the storm. The wind tore at his cloak as he made his way to where his horse was stabled. He had to reach Bjorn's steading, had to warn him. But even as he rode through the darkness, the traveller's words echoed in his mind. Back in the mead hall, the stranger continued his tales, each one spreading the legend further. Stories of battles in deep waters, of monsters slain and ships saved. Tales of a warrior who had been betrayed but returned stronger, wielding powers, drawn from the very creatures he now hunted. But it was the quieter stories that troubled Harold most as he rode. Tales of the hunter questioning survivors about specific ships, about raids that seemed too well timed to be chance. Stories suggesting that the hunter was methodically working his way through the fjords, following some pattern only he could see. As his horse struggled against the wind, Harold remembered something else. How Bjorn had changed after that night, how their raids had taken on a different character, how sometimes, in the depths of night watches, he'd heard his leader speaking to something in the waters beside their ship, how their luck in finding rich targets had seemed too good to be true. The traveller's horn sounded one last time, its note carrying impossibly through the storm to reach Harold's ears. It reminded him of another sound, the cry Eirik had made as he fell into the dark waters. Not a cry of fear, Harold realized now, but one of betrayal, of recognition that his brothers had chosen darkness over his wisdom, and now that betrayed brother had returned, wielding weapons forged from the bones of monsters, seeking answers about what his former warband had become. Harold spurred his horse harder, praying he would reach Bjorn's steading before the hunter's blade found them. But in his heart, he knew it was already too late. The legend of the Boneblade Hunter was spreading through every port and fishing village, carried by horns like the travelers, whispered in mead halls and around fire pits. The doom was walking the fjords with a blade of bone, and all their monstrous allies couldn't stop the tide of vengeance that was slowly but surely making its way toward them. The storm grew stronger, and in its voice, Harold could have sworn. He heard the humming of a bone-forged blade. The black feather spiraled down from the iron-grey sky, landing on the bone blade's translucent surface with impossible precision. Eirik watched as the feather seemed to melt into the weapon's surface, leaving a dark stain that pulsed like a warning beneath the ice-clear bone. "A storm crow's feather," Grida said from behind him. She had appeared silently, as was her way. Her white hair wild in the rising wind. "The harbingers are restless today." 3 months of successful hunts had changed Eirik. His beard was now more white than grey, and lines of power marked his face like the runes he carved. But it was his eyes that had changed most. They held the same ancient knowledge he'd first seen in Grida's gaze, the wisdom that came from walking too long in the depths of mystery. "Something's different," he said, watching another storm crow wheel overhead. "The waters feel wrong. You've learned to read the signs well." Grida settled onto a weathered log, her staff clicking against the stones. "Too well, perhaps. They've noticed the monsters, the ones who command them." She traced patterns in the sand with her staff, complex swirls that made Eirik's eyes hurt. "Did you think it was chance that led your former brothers to betray you? That Bjorn simply chose that moment, that storm, to cast you out?" Eirik felt his blade hum with shared tension. "What are you saying? You were marked, Erik Thorvaldsen. Marked from the day you first questioned the tide of darkness rising in the fjords. The deep ones have agents among men, those who serve them willingly, trading their humanity for power. Your friend Bjorn had already made his choices long before that storm. The revelation hit Erik like a physical blow. He remembered now, subtle changes in Bjorn over the years, successful raids that seemed too perfectly timed, the way his former friend would sometimes stare into deep waters as if listening to voices only he could hear. "How long?" he demanded. "How long have these things been corrupting our people?" "Longer than any living memory." Grida's voice took on the rhythmic quality she used when sharing ancient lore. In the time before time, when the first men came to these waters, they found the deep ones already here. Some fought them, using arts like those I've taught you. Others chose to serve, thinking they could gain power over their fellows. She stood, using her staff to draw more complex patterns. Where the wood touched sand, frost formed in spiraling designs. But what you've stumbled into now is something darker. The marks you found on that young beast last week, I've seen there. Like before, in the oldest parts of the Bone Forger's tome, they're binding runes meant to enslave the creatures to a single will. "Someone's building an army," Eirik said, the pieces falling into place. "The attacks on fishing boats, the missing vessels, the way the monsters seem to hunt in patterns. Yes, and now they know you've noticed. The storm crows don't come for simple monster hunts, Erik. They're drawn to greater workings, to moments when the old powers stir." She pointed to where the feather had stained his blade. "They're warning us. Something is coming." As if in confirmation, thunder rolled across the fjord. But this was no natural storm gathering. The clouds moved against the wind, swirling in patterns that spoke of conscious direction. The water's surface turned dark, not with shadow, but with something rising from the depths. "Listen carefully," Grida said, her voice urgent. "What I taught you about bone forging, that was just the beginning. There are deeper mysteries, more dangerous arts. Arts that could help you face what's coming, but at a terrible price." "What price? The blade you forged? The memory of joy you sacrificed to wake it? That was a small working compared to what you'd need to learn." Her eyes held a mixture of concern and fierce pride. "To master the deeper arts, you might have to sacrifice much more, pieces of your very soul." Erik looked at his blade, at the stain left by the stormcrow's feather. The weapon seemed to pulse in response to his attention, sharing his disquiet. "Tell me, there are ways to bind power that go beyond simply forging weapons, ways to take the essence of what you kill and make it truly part of yourself. But such workings, they change more than just your abilities. They change what you are." The wind carried the cries of more stormcrows, gathering like black leaves against the roiling sky. Erik remembered the marks he'd seen on the monsters he'd killed, the patterns that spoke of bondage and control. "If I don't learn these arts, if I face them with what I know now, you'll fail," Grida said simply. "What's coming is older and darker than anything you've faced. The one who leads them, who placed their mark on Bjorn's soul. They've had centuries to perfect their arts. They won't face you directly. They'll send those you once called brothers, turned into something no longer fully human. And behind them they'll send horrors drawn from the deepest waters, bound by runes of power you can't yet understand." Erik felt the truth of it in his bones, in the way his blade trembled with anticipation or fear. The monster he'd killed today had been larger than any before, yet he'd sensed it was only a herald of worse to come. His former brothers were only pawns in a game that had been playing out for generations. "Teach me," he said, knowing as he spoke that he was crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. "Teach me everything, no matter the cost." Grida's smile held no humor, only grim appreciation of his resolve. "Come then, while the storm crows watch, I'll show you the first of the blood bindings, and may the old gods forgive us both for what you must become." Above them, the storm crows gathered in ever greater numbers, their harsh cries a chorus that spoke of battles yet to come. The feather's stain spread deeper into Erik's blade, a warning written in shadow beneath the bone's translucent surface. The time of simple monster hunting was ending. A darker game was afoot in the fjords, and Eric would need more than just a bone-forged blade to survive what was coming. The storm broke over them as they walked to Grida's dwelling, but its thunder couldn't quite mask the sound of ancient powers stirring in the deep. Moonlight turned the fjord's surface to hammered silver, broken only by the ripples where something vast moved beneath. Eric stood in his boat's prow, one hand on his bone blade, the other holding a scale he'd taken from his last kill. The scale was unlike anything he'd seen before, iridescent as pearl, but hard as iron, marked with runes that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. "Show me your secrets," he whispered, letting 3 drops of his blood fall onto the scale's surface. Grida's teachings about bloodbinding were bearing fruit. Each drop sank into the scale like water into sand, and the runes began to glow with a cold blue light. The knowledge came as images rather than words, a creature that could shed its skin like a snake that could take forms other than its own. A beast that walked in 2 worlds, one of water and scale, one of flesh and bone. The scale had belonged to a shapeshifter, one of the oldest and most dangerous of the Deep One's servants. Movement caught his eye, a disturbance in the water different from the usual patterns. Something was surfacing, but not with the violent burst he'd come to expect from the monsters he hunted. This approached with deliberate grace, almost human in its control. The figure that rose from the waves might have passed for a man, if not for eyes that glowed with that same glacial blue he'd seen in so many monster gazes. Water streamed from pale flesh that seemed to shimmer with hints of scale beneath the skin. "Hunter!" the creature spoke, its voice carrying harmonics that no human throat could produce. "We would talk, you and I." Eric's blade hummed a warning, but he kept it lowered. "You're the first of your kind to speak to me with words rather than teeth. Perhaps that is because I remember words, remember being as you are." The creature moved closer, its movements liquid smooth. "We were not always what we are now. Some of us were once men before the Deep Ones offered their gifts." "Gifts?" Eric's grip tightened on his weapon. "Or chains?" "Both." "Neither," a smile revealed. "Teeth too sharp for human gums. The old powers care nothing for human notions of freedom or bondage. They offer transformation, transcendence, as they offered to your friend Bjorn." The name hit like a physical blow. "What do you know of Bjorn?" "I know he took their offer willingly. Know he had already chosen his path before he cast you to the waves." The creature's form seemed to ripple, scales becoming more prominent before fading again. "But you, they marked for a different fate. They saw something in you, a potential for change that went beyond mere corruption." Eric thought of Grida's warnings, of the blood bindings he'd learned. "They wanted me to become like you. They wanted you to choose it, as so many others have. The storm that night was no accident. Your betrayal was a test, to see if defeat would drive you to accept their power." The creature's laugh held echoes of deep water currents. "Instead, you found another path, learned older magics, became something they didn't expect." The scale in Eric's hand grew colder, its runes pulsing in time with the creature's words. Through the blood binding, he could feel the truth of what it said, and sense something more, a resonance between the magic in his blade and the power that had transformed this being from man to monster. Why tell me this now? Because change comes to these waters. The Deep Ones stir in their sleep, and their servants gather for war. The creature's form wavered again, becoming more serpentine before stabilizing. "They fear what you've become, Hunter. Fear what you might yet become. The old magics you've learned, they're only the beginning of what's possible. And you're warning me out of kindness?" Eric let sarcasm edge his voice. "I warn you because every choice must be informed to have meaning. I chose what I became. Bjorn chose his transformation. Now you must choose. Continue as you are, fighting their servants one by one, or—" It gestured to the scale in Eric's hand. "Learn what that really is. Learn what the blood bindings can truly accomplish." The creature's form began to dissolve, scales becoming more prominent as human features faded. "Think on what I've said, Hunter. The Deep One's servants gather in the northern fjords. Bjorn leads them now, wearing a shape as changed as mine. When you face him, remember, every monster you've killed was once something else. Every transformation began with a choice." As the being slipped beneath the waves, its final words drifted back. "Choose wisely, Hunter. The old powers care nothing for human morality, but they do appreciate irony. How fitting if the man cast out for cowardice became the monster that hunts monsters." Eric stood motionless as the ripples faded, feeling the scale pulse against his palm. Through the blood binding, he could sense more now, not just the shape-shifting magic, but the process of transformation itself. The knowledge burned in his mind, offering power beyond anything he'd dreamed if he was willing to pay the price. His blade hummed, sharing his disquiet. The weapon had changed too, he realized. The joy he'd sacrificed to forge it had been transformed into something else, just as the creature he'd spoken with had been transformed. Everything was about transformation, about the choices that led to change. The scale's runes flared once more, showing him visions of possibility, of a form that could move through water as easily as air, that could match the monsters on their own terms. But with the visions came understanding of the cost. To gain such power, he would have to sacrifice more than memories. He would have to surrender pieces of his humanity itself. Dawn was breaking as Eric turned his boat toward Grida's dwelling. He needed answers, needed to understand more about the choices ahead. The scale continued to pulse with offered power, and his blade seemed to answer it, singing songs of battle and transformation. Above him, a lone storm crow circled, watching his choice with ancient eyes. The ring glinted dully in the torchlight, a heavy band of dark metal set with a stone that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. Eric turned it in his fingers, feeling the cold pulse of old magic within its crafting. The ring's former owner sat bound before him, a pirate captain whose raid had ended badly when the Boneblade hunter emerged from the morning mist. "Where did you get this?" Eric demanded, holding the ring where the captain could see it. The man's crew lay dead on their vessel, killed not by Eric's blade, but by something that had risen from the depths when their attack failed, as if the monsters themselves enforced some dark covenant. "It was a gift," the captain spat, though fear had replaced the arrogance in his eyes. "From your old friend Bjorn Blacktooth. Said it would help us find rich targets, keep us safe from the Deep Ones." A bitter laugh. "Didn't mention it would. Kill us if we failed him." Eric studied the ring more carefully, noting patterns in its metalwork that echoed the binding runes he'd seen on monster flesh. "How many other crews has he given these to?" "7 that I know of, maybe more." The captain shifted uncomfortably in his bonds. "We're all bound to him now, bound to whatever he serves. The rings make sure we stay loyal. Tell me about Bjorn. When did you last see him?" 3 weeks ago, at the gathering." Fear made the captain's voice quaver. "He's changed, your old oath brother. Changed in ways that—" He swallowed hard. "He's not human anymore, not really. Wears a man's shape most times. But sometimes, when the mood takes him, I saw him step into the water one night, saw his skin ripple like the northern lights. When he came back up, he was something else." Eric remembered the shapeshifter's words about transformation and choice. "This gathering, where?" "The northern fjords, where the old stones stand in the water. He's calling all his marked crews there when the winter moon is full. Says the Deep Ones are stirring, that it's time to—" The captain's voice failed, as the ring in Eric's hand began to pulse with darker light. "Time to what?" "Time to wake them. The old ones, the true powers of the deep. Bjorn says they've slept too long, that their servants have grown weak without their direct guidance." Sweat beaded on the captain's brow despite the cold. "The rings, they're not just for control. They're for sacrifice. When the time comes, our blood will help fuel the awakening." The ring's stone was definitely glowing now, a sickly purple light that cast strange shadows. The captain began to shake, his eyes wide with terror. "He's listening. Through the ring he can hear—" "Oh, Lise, you have to—" The man's words cut off in a choking gasp. Dark lines began spreading from his heart, following the paths of veins and arteries. Eric recognized death magic when he saw it. Grida had warned him of such workings. Before the captain's last breath rattled out, he managed a few final words. "The stones. Remember the old ones. They hunger for more than just blood." Eric watched as the pirate's body crumbled, flesh turning to a fine grey ash that scattered in the sea wind. All that remained was a dark stain where the man had sat and the ring that still pulsed with malevolent purpose. Using the techniques Grida had taught him, Eric began to probe the ring's enchantments. The blood binding let him see layers of magic, corruption wrapped around compulsion, wrapped around a core of transformative power. The ring was more than just a tool of control. It was a seed of change, slowly altering those who wore it until they were ready for a greater transformation. He thought of the 7 other crews the captain had mentioned, each wearing rings like this one. How many raiders had Bjorn bound to his service? How many were being prepared as sacrifices to wake whatever slumbered in the deep? The ring grew. Colder in his hand, and through its magic, he caught fragments of vision. Standing stones rising from dark waters, their surfaces carved with runes that made the binding marks he'd seen before seem simple by comparison. He saw gathered ships with crews that were no longer quite human, saw Bjorn standing among them, wearing a shape that blurred between man and monster. But it was the presence behind these images that chilled him most. Vast intelligences stirring in the lightless depths, ancient beyond reckoning. The deep ones that all these preparations served were far more terrible than the monsters he'd been hunting. Eric closed his fist around the ring, letting his blade's power harmonize with the corrupted artifact. The weapons he'd forged from Monsterbone could do more than just kill. They could absorb power, transform it. As his blade began to hum, he felt the ring's magics begin to shift and change. The process was dangerous. He could feel the ring trying to influence him, even as he worked to subvert its power. Images flickered through his mind. Himself wearing the ring, accepting its power, becoming something greater and more terrible than even Bjorn had become. The temptation was strong, but the memory of joy he'd sacrificed to his blade reminded him of what was at stake. When the working was done, the ring had changed. Its stone now held a shimmer, like captured aurora, and its magics had been transformed. It was no longer a tool of corruption, but a compass that could lead him to others of its kind. Through it, he could track Bjorn's movements, find the gathering the captain had spoken of, but the cost of this transformation had been high. Eric could feel new shadows in his soul, where the ring's dark power had touched him. The price of wielding such magic was always paid in pieces of oneself. He slipped the ring onto a leather thong and hung it around his neck, opposite the pocket where he kept the shapeshifter's scale. 2 artifacts of transformation, each offering paths to power that could help him face what was coming. But as the ring settled against his chest, he wondered how many such changes could a man undergo before he was no longer himself. The winter moon would be full in 2 weeks. By then, he needed to decide who and what he would be when he faced his former oath brother. The ring pulsed once more against his skin, offering dark possibilities, while his blade hummed with the pure power of Monsterbone and sacrificed joy. Above him, the storm crows circled, watching his choice with ancient eyes. The abandoned longship loomed out of the fog like a creature born of nightmare. Its dragonhead prow had been carved not with traditional serpents, but with images that made Eric's eyes hurt, things with too many teeth and eyes that seemed to watch him as he approached. The ship's anchor chain vanished into the dark waters, but there was something wrong about its angle, about the way it moved against the current. "Blood in the water," Grida had said when her ravens brought word of the derelict vessel. "Old blood, dark workings. Be careful, hunter. Some ships are best left to drift." But the transformed ring at his throat had pulled him here, its aurora-like glow brightening as he approached the ghost ship. Whatever had happened aboard that vessel was connected to Bjorn's plans, to the Deep Ones stirring in their sleep. The anchor was the first sign that this was more than simple abandonment. The massive iron piece was carved with the same binding runes he'd seen before, but these were older, their power more refined. As Eirik traced them with his fingers, he felt echoes of their purpose, not just to hold the ship in place, but to hold something else, something that dwelt in the depths below. "A binding anchor," he whispered, remembering passages from the Bone Forger's tome. "They used it to call the Deep Ones, to make bargains with them." His blade hummed in warning as he pulled himself aboard. The deck was stained with old blood, and not all of it was human. Dark ichor had eaten into the wood in patterns that spoke of ritual rather than battle. Near the mainmast, he found the first bodies, or what remained of them. The crew had died hard, that much was clear, but their deaths hadn't been meant as mere killing. Their bodies had been arranged in specific patterns, their blood channeled through grooves carved into the deck. Some showed signs of partial transformation, scales scattered among flesh, bones that had begun to shift and change before death took them. Testing the process, Eirik realized. These had been early experiments in the magic that had changed Bjorn, that had created the shapeshifters he'd encountered. Not all transformations succeeded. These failures had been left as offerings to whatever waited below. In the captain's cabin, he found the proof. An altar had been built against the stern windows, constructed from human and monster bones bound together with silver wire and dark iron. Before it lay a logbook, its pages stained, with blood and seawater but still readable. The entries told a story that chilled him more than the winter wind. This ship had been Bjorn's first command, long before he'd formed the warband that had cast Eirik out. Even then, he'd been seeking power in dark places, making bargains with things that should have been left undisturbed. The final entry was dated 3 years before Eirik's betrayal. "The Deep Ones accept our offerings. Each failure brings us closer to success. They say the blood of warriors carries the strongest potential for change. Men who have already proven their worth in battle, whose spirits are strong enough to survive transformation. But it must be willing sacrifice, or the change burns. Then from within, they suggest a test. Take such a warrior, one whose heart holds true courage, and break him. See if defeat drives him to accept the gift freely." Eirik's hands tightened on the logbook. All of it, his friendship with Bjorn, his position in the warband, even the storm that had led to his betrayal, had been planned. He had been chosen as a potential sacrifice years before that night. A sound from above drew him back to the deck. The fog had thickened, but now it moved with purpose, coiling around the ship like a living thing. The binding anchor's chain grew taut as something pulled on it from below. Then he saw them, shapes moving through the mist, transparent but gaining substance with each passing moment. The ghosts of the failed sacrifices, their forms caught between human and monster, forever trapped in the agony of incomplete transformation. But they weren't attacking. Instead, they seemed to be trying to show him something. Their spectral forms gestured toward the bow, where a hatch led to the ship's hold. The transformed ring at his throat grew colder, while the shapeshifters' scale in his pocket began to pulse with answering power. In the hold, he found what the ghosts wanted him to see. Beneath the standard cargo of trade goods and weapons lay another altar, larger and more elaborate than the one above. And chained to it was an artifact that made both his magical tokens resonate with recognition. A massive crown, forged from the bones of Deep Ones, and bound with the same dark iron he'd seen in Bjorn's rings. This was no mere ritual focus. This was a key, a tool meant to channel the power needed to wake the ancient things that slept in the depths. Through his blood binding with the ring and scale, Eirik could sense the crown's purpose. It would bind the bearer not just to the Deep One's power, but to their will. Whoever wore it would become their voice in the world above, a conduit for their return. As he studied the crown, the ghosts drifted around him, their half-transformed faces filled with warning. They had been sacrificed in failed attempts to create a suitable bearer for this artifact. Through their spectral forms, Eirik could see the process, how the dark magic had twisted them, how their bodies and souls had been torn apart by power they weren't ready to contain. But Bjorn had survived the transformation, had proven himself worthy to bear this crown, to serve as the Deep One's mortal voice. The gathering in the northern fjords wasn't just about sacrifice, it was about coronation, about completing a plan years in the making. The ghost's warnings grew more urgent as something vast disturbed the waters beneath the ship. The binding anchor's power was fading, weakened by years of exposure to salt and tide. Whatever the anchor had been holding down there was beginning to break free. Eirik had what he needed. Let the Deep Ones have their ghost ship back. He knew their plans now, knew what had to be done. As he climbed back into his boat, he saw the spectral forms line the derelict's rail, watching him with eyes that held both envy and hope. They had died in the search for power and transformation. He had found another way, forged his own path to power through bone and blood and sacrifice. The ghost ship vanished into the fog behind him, but Eirik carried its secrets with him, and with them the knowledge of what awaited at the gathering of the winter moon. His blade hummed with deadly purpose, eager to meet the power that had orchestrated his betrayal, that had twisted his oath brother into something no longer human. The transformed ring and the shapeshifter's scale pulsed in harmony, offering their own paths to power. But now, having seen the price of failure, the cost of transformation gone wrong, Eirik wondered if there might be another way, not to match the Deep One's power, but to turn it against them. The war horn's deep note echoed across the fjord, drawing answers from vessels hidden in the morning mist. One by one, fishing boats and small trading ships emerged from hidden coves, a fleet of the hunted, come to stand against the hunters. Each vessel bore marks of monster attacks, each crew carried memories of losses suffered in the deep waters, and on their masts they flew a new standard, a bone-white field bearing the image of Eirik's blade. 3 days until the winter moon, said Margaret Carlson, the shield maiden whose brothers Eirik had saved from the ice-eyed beast. She stood beside him at the prow of her family's fishing boat, now transformed into a war vessel. Will they be ready in time? Eirik watched as more ships appeared, guided by the horn's call. They'll have to be. We won't get another chance. At this, the past week had been a blur of preparation and training. After discovering the truth aboard the ghost ship, Eirik had called in every debt, every favor owed by those he'd saved. But he wasn't just gathering warriors. He was teaching them to fight monsters. Watch the water's motion, he demonstrated to a group of fishermen, using his blade to point out subtle patterns in the waves. Sea creatures leave wakes even when deep. Learn to read them, and you'll never be taken by surprise. To others, he taught the basics of bone forging, not the deep magics that required soul sacrifice, but simpler workings that could turn monster bones into weapons capable of piercing their hide. The beach near Grida's dwelling had become a forge, where transformed bones glowed with power under the aurora's light. The weapons remember what they were, he explained, helping a young warrior bind power into a spear point carved from monster vertebrae. Let them guide your hands. They want to strike their own kind. But it was the knowledge from the ghost ship that proved most valuable. Understanding how the Deep One's power worked, how it transformed those who accepted it, gave them advantages they desperately needed. The changed ones were human once, he told his gathered allies. They still think like raiders, still follow patterns of attack. And those who've only partially transformed, they're bound by the rings they wear. Break the ring's connection, and you break their power. The war horn sounded again, and this time Eirik raised it to his own lips to answer. The artifact thrummed with power. It was more than just a signal device. Grida had helped him forge it from the bones of 3 different monsters, binding their essence into its voice. When blown in battle, it would remind the Deep One's servants of what they once were, weakening their connection to their dark masters. You should be preparing yourself, not just them, Grida said, appearing beside him with her usual silence. The old woman looked troubled, her eyes on the gathering fleet. The rituals I showed you, the ones that would let me match Bjorn's transformation. Eirik shook his head. That's what they wanted all along, to drive me to choose that path. And you think you can face what he's become without changing yourself? Without accepting similar power? She gestured to the transformed ring at his throat, the scale in his pocket. You carry the means of transformation with you, yet you hesitate to use them. I've seen where that path leads. Eric touched his blade, feeling the familiar hum of power. The ghost ship showed me the price of trying to match the deep ones at their own game. There has to be another way. A commotion from the shore drew their attention. One of the scouts had returned, bringing word of movement in the northern fjords. Ships gathering in the darkness, their crews no longer fully human. At their head, a vessel larger than the rest, its hull marked with runes of binding and transformation. Bjorn's flagship, Eirik said grimly. The captain spoke true. He's gathering all his marked crews for the ritual. Then you're running out of time. Grida's voice held warning. If you won't transform yourself, you'd better be sure of your plan. Once the deep ones fully wake, they won't wake. Eric's hand tightened on the war horn. The crown in their temple ship was meant for a willing bearer, someone who chose transformation, who embraced their power. That's why they went to such lengths to break me, to make me desperate enough to accept their gift. Understanding dawned in Grida's eyes. You mean to turn their own power against them? Every working you've shown me, every ritual in the Bone Forger's tome, they're all about transformation, about taking one thing and making it something else. He touched the ring at his throat, remembering how he'd changed its purpose. Even their own magics can be transformed if you understand them well enough. The old woman studied him with new respect. A dangerous game, Hunter. If I fail, I'll die as myself, not as some half-transformed thing bound to ancient monsters. He raised the horn again, sounding a complex pattern that sent the gathered ships into motion. But I don't intend to fail. The fleet began forming into the positions they'd practiced. Fishing boats turned warrior vessels, crews who'd learned to read water and wield bone-forged weapons. They weren't warriors by trade, but they knew these waters, knew what it meant to face monsters in the deep. More importantly, they knew what they fought for. Homes, families, the right to sail their fjords without fear. The war horn's call faded across the water, but its power lingered. In the depths below, things stirred in response, not just the transformed raiders and their monster allies, but older powers, ancient things, feeling the tremors of approaching conflict. Eirik looked to the northern horizon, where storm clouds gathered unnaturally against the wind. Somewhere out there, Bjorn waited with his changed warriors and his dark crown, preparing to complete the transformation that would wake the deep. Once from their sleep, the winter moon was rising, and with it, the time for final choices approached. The horn grew colder in Eirik's hands, responding to its wielder's resolve. He had chosen his path, not transformation into something greater and more terrible, but transformation of the power itself. The deep ones had tried to break him, to make him embrace their dark gifts. Instead, they had taught him how to break their power in return. Now it was time to show them the true meaning of transformation. The blood compass spun wildly in Eirik's palm, its needle crafted from the transformed raider's ring. Dark energy pulsed within the device, responding to the presence of its corrupted kin. Through it, he could sense the other rings Bjorn had distributed, could feel them gathering like stars of cold fire in the northern darkness. "They're forming a circle," he told Margaret, who stood ready at the steering oar. 7 ships, just as the captain said, and in the center, the compass needle trembled, pointing to something that made its magic resonate with warning. The winter moon hung low and swollen above the horizon, painting the fjord's waters in shades of bone and silver. Perfect night for hunting, though this time Eirik wasn't sure who was hunter and who was prey. His fleet moved through the fog in practiced formations. Fishing boats turned war vessels, sliding silent through the dark waters. Every crew carried bone-forged weapons now, and their eyes held the knowledge he'd taught them. How to read water, how to sense the presence of monsters, how to fight things that should not exist. The first sign of enemy presence came as a change in the water's motion. subtle currents moving against the tide, patterns that spoke of large bodies moving in the depths below. The blood compass grew colder in Eric's hand, its needle tracking whatever swam beneath them. "Remember your training," he called softly to the nearby ships. "They'll try to separate us, to pick us off one by one. Don't let them break the formation." As if in response to his words, the first attack came. A shape rose from the depths, water cascading from a form caught between human and serpent. One of Bjorn's transformed raiders, too eager to wait for the ritual's completion. The thing that had once been human launched itself at the nearest fishing boat, scales gleaming in the moonlight. But Eric's allies were ready, bone-forged spears thrust upward, their runes flaring with cold fire. The transformed raider screamed, a sound that began human but ended in something else, as weapons remember from monster bone pierced its hybrid flesh. More attacks followed, more half-changed things rising from the depths. Each time, Eric's crews met them with weapons and knowledge, turning their small boats into floating fortresses of bone-forged defense. The waters began to stain with blood, both red and dark, and the fog took on the copper taste of violence. Through the blood compass, Eric tracked their progress toward the ritual site. The 7 corrupted ships had finished forming their circle, their crews chanting in voices that made the water itself shudder. At the center of their formation, a larger vessel rose like a dark cathedral against the stars. Bjorn's flagship, transformed by the same magic that had changed its master. "Hold steady," Eric commanded as more shapes moved beneath them. These were larger than the changed raiders, true monsters, called by their corrupted kin to join. The battle. He reached for the war horn at his belt, feeling its power pulse in answer to his touch. The horn's deep note rolled across the waters, carrying harmonics that no natural instrument could produce. In its voice were the death cries of monsters, the memories of what they had once been before the deep ones changed them. Below, the great shapes faltered in their approach, caught between their binding and the horn's reminder of lost freedom. But then another sound answered, a deeper call, rising from Bjorn's flagship. Dark energy rippled through the water, and Eirik felt the transformed ring at his throat grow cold. Through the blood compass, he sensed the power gathering for the ritual's completion. "They're starting early," he realized. "They know we're coming. Bjorn's not waiting for the moon to reach its peak." As if to confirm his words, the waters around the ritual circle began to glow with an unnatural light. The 7 corrupted ships burned with eldritch fire, their crews chanting, rising to a fever pitch. Power flowed between them like dark lightning, converging on Bjorn's vessel. Eirik raised the war horn again, but this time wove a different harmony into its call. Not just monster memories, but the power of transformation itself. The same force he'd used to change the raider's ring. The sound rippled out across the water, carrying with it the possibility of change, of choice. The effect was immediate. Some of the transformed raiders faltered in their attacks, clutching their heads as if in pain. The corruption in their rings wavered, momentarily weakened by the horn's reminder that transformation could work both ways. "Now!" Eric commanded, "while they're confused!" His fleet surged forward, bone-forged weapons gleaming. They struck the ritual circle's outer edge like a wave breaking on rocks, small boats darting between the larger corrupted ships. The changed raiders fought back, but their movements were uncoordinated, their power disrupted by the war horns. Call. Through the blood compass, Eric tracked the flow of energy. The ritual was using the 7 ships as focus points, channeling power through their corrupted crews into whatever waited on Bjorn's flagship. If they could break that circle, disrupt the pattern, a massive shape breached beside them. A true sea serpent, larger than any Eirik had yet faced. But even as it rose, he saw the marks on its scales, the runes of binding that showed it was no natural monster. This too was something transformed, something changed by the Deep One's power. The bone blade hummed eagerly in his hands as he faced the creature. The joy he'd sacrificed to forge it sang through its length, ready to remind this beast of what it had lost in its own transformation. Behind him, Margaret steered their boat with the skill born of a lifetime on these waters, keeping them just beyond the monster's reach. "You're not the only ones who can transform things," Eric told the serpent, letting his blade's power flow. The monster's eyes widened as if in recognition, perhaps remembering what it had once been, perhaps sensing the choice that lay before it. The battle was fully joined now, spreading across the dark waters in patterns of bone light and corruption. But Eric knew this was just the beginning. The true test waited on that darkened flagship, where Bjorn prepared to complete his transformation, to wake the Deep Ones from their ancient sleep. The blood compass pulled stronger, guiding him toward his former oath brother. Above, the winter moon climbed higher, its light catching on bone-forged weapons and transformed flesh alike. The time of final choices approached, and with it, the moment when they would learn whether Eric's way of transformation could overcome the Deep One's dark power. Everything would change tonight. The only question was, what would they all become when the changing was done? The broken oath ring lay between them on the flagship's deck, its silver surface cracked and tarnished. 15 years ago, Eric and Bjorn had cut their palms over this very ring, mixing blood to seal their brotherhood. Now it served only as a reminder of promises betrayed and bonds corrupted. "You understand now, don't you?" Bjorn's voice held harmonics that no human throat should produce. His form seemed to shift in the moonlight, skin rippling with patterns that echoed the sea's depths. "Why it had to be you. Why we chose you for the testing." Eric kept his blade ready, watching how his former oath brother moved. The transformation was more complete than he'd imagined. Bjorn was barely holding human shape, power from the ritual circle bleeding through him like dark lightning. "Because I questioned," Eric said. "Because I saw the darkness growing in you and dared to speak of it. Because you were strong enough to survive what was coming." Bjorn's laugh held the sound of waves crushing bone. "The Deep Ones saw it in you, the potential for true transformation. Not this halfway state that other warriors achieve, but complete transcendence." He gestured to himself, to the way his flesh seemed to flow like water. "Even I am just a precursor, a herald of what you could become." Around them, battle raged across the dark waters. Bone-forged weapons flashed against transformed flesh, while the warhorn's call still echoed, weakening the bonds that held the changed raiders to their monstrous masters. But here, at the ritual's heart, time seemed to slow. "That night in the storm," Eric said, "when I begged you to turn back, you'd already made your choice, hadn't you? I made my choice 3 years before, when they first showed me what was possible." Bjorn's form rippled again, scales showing through flesh before smoothing away. "The Deep Ones have waited centuries for the right vessel, the right warrior to bear their crown. When they showed me your potential, I knew my role. Break. Drive you to desperation, make you willing to accept their gift. And instead I found another path, learned older magics, learned to forge dead bone into weapons, to bind minor powers to your will." Bjorn's smile showed too many teeth. "While I learned to become something new, something greater, the Deep Ones reshape flesh itself, offer transformation beyond anything your bone forger could teach." The ritual circle's power pulsed stronger, and Bjorn's form became even less human. Tentacles writhed beneath his skin, and his eyes held the cold depths of the ocean's darkest places. The crown waited on its altar behind him, its bone surface, drinking in the moon's light. "Look at you," Bjorn continued, "still clinging to your humanity like it's something precious. Still thinking you can fight the tide of change with dead bones and sacrificed memories. You don't even use the tools of true power you carry." Eric felt the transformed ring at his throat grow cold, the shapeshifter's scale burn in his pocket. "I've seen where your kind of transformation leads. The ghost ship showed me the price of trying to match the Deep One's power. The failures, the weak ones who couldn't survive the change." Bjorn laughed again. "They were necessary steps, each death teaching us more about the process. But you were to be the culmination. The perfect vessel, strong enough to bear the crown's full. Your power As if in response to his words, the crown pulsed with dark energy. Through his blood binding, Eric could sense its purpose more clearly now. Not just a tool of power, but a key to unlock something vast and hungry that slept in the depths. "Your fleet fights well," Bjorn observed, watching the battle around. "Them. You've taught them to wield bone weapons, to face monsters without fear, but they're fighting yesterday's war, brother. The time of men is ending. When the Deep Ones wake, all will be transformed. Those who accept their gift willingly will rule the new world they create. And those who don't will be transformed anyway, their flesh reshaped into vessels for the Deep One's power. The only choice is whether to rule or serve in the changing." Bjorn gestured to the crown. "It's not too late, brother. Take up the crown. Accept the gift you were chosen for. Rule beside me in the world to come." Eric felt power pulse through his blade, the joy he'd sacrificed to forge it singing a warning. The transformed ring and shapeshifter's scale resonated in harmony, showing him visions of what he could become. The temptation was strong, to match power with power, to transform himself into something mighty enough to face what Bjorn had become. But in those visions, he saw the truth. Every transformation the Deep One's offered was really a form of bondage. Every gift came with chains of flesh and spirit. Even Bjorn, who thought himself so powerful, was just another vessel for their will. "You're wrong about one thing," Eric said quietly. "I have used the power I carry, just not the way you expected." The transformed ring at his throat began to glow with aurora light. Its magic transformed from corruption to revelation. The scale in his pocket burned like captured starfire, its power reshaped from bondage to liberation. Even his blade seemed to shine brighter, the joy he'd sacrificed becoming something more than just a weapon. "What have you done?" Bjorn's voice held the first note of uncertainty. "Learned the true meaning of transformation." Eric raised his blade. "Everything can be changed, brother. Even the Deep One's power, even the bonds they use to hold their servants." The broken oath ring between them began to glow as well, its silver surface catching the light of transformed magic. In its reflection, Bjorn saw himself clearly for the first time, saw past the power to the chains that bound him, that had bound him since the day he first accepted the Deep One's gift. "The crown calls to you," Bjorn said, but his voice wavered. "You can feel its power." "I feel its purpose," Eric corrected. "And I know now why you really chose me. Not because I was strong enough to bear it, but because I was strong enough to destroy it." Understanding and fear mixed in Bjorn's inhuman eyes as Eric stepped forward, his transformed artifacts glowing with power that could break the bonds of flesh and spirit alike. The time had come to show the Deep Ones that transformation worked. Both ways, that their own power could be turned against the chains they forged. The broken oath ring gleamed between them, a reminder of brotherhood betrayed and choices made, but also a promise of one final transformation, one last chance to choose a different path. The beast's heart pulsed on the altar beside the crown, larger than a man's torso and translucent as sea ice. Within its crystalline chambers, something darker than blood flowed. The essence of transformation itself, the raw power the Deep Ones use to reshape flesh and spirit. Through it, Eric could sense the vast intelligences stirring below, pressing against the barriers of sleep as the ritual drew them toward waking. "Even now you don't see the gift we offer," Bjorn said, as his form continued to shift and flow. "The heart calls to you. You feel its power." "I feel its chains," Eric corrected, his transformed artifacts glowing brighter. The ring at his throat burned like captured aurora, while the scale in his pocket hummed with liberating force. His blade sang with the joy he'd sacrificed, turned now to something greater than mere weaponcraft. The battle raged around their flagship, bone-forged weapons flashing against transformed flesh as Eric's fleet engaged the circle of corrupted ships. The warhorn's call still echoed across the water, weakening the bonds that held the changed raiders to their monstrous masters. But here, at the ritual's center, time seemed to crystallize around the pulsing heart. Bjorn moved with liquid grace, his shape becoming less human with each passing moment. Tentacles writhed beneath his skin, and his eyes held the cold depths of abyssal trenches. The heart is the key, the source of all transformation. Take it, claim its power, become what you were meant to be. Instead of answering, Eric reached out with his transformed artifact's power. Through them he could see the heart's true nature, not just a vessel of power, but a prison of sorts. Within its crystalline chambers, he sensed echoes of all the transformations it had fueled, all the lives it had changed. And beneath those echoes, something older, something that remembered what it had been before the Deep Ones claimed it. You never asked, did you? Eric said softly. Where the Deep Ones got their power, what they really are. The heart's pulse quickened as if responding to his words. Through his blood binding with the transformed ring and scale, Eric felt ancient memories stir. Creatures of light and air, beings that had once swum in shallower seas under brighter stars. The first ones, the deep ones, had transformed, twisted into the source of their power. They were like us once, he continued, watching understanding dawn in Bjorn's inhuman eyes. The things sleeping in the depths, before they found this heart, before they learned to use its power to change others. They were people of the sea who found something older than themselves, something that offered them transformation, and they took that power and used it to force change on others, building their empire of flesh and bone. The heart shuddered on its altar, its crystalline surface beginning to crack. Within its chambers, the dark essence swirled faster, responding to truth spoken aloud after centuries of silence. "Lies!" Bjorn snarled, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "The Deep Ones are gods of the sea, masters of transformation. They're slaves to their own power." Eric cut him off. "Bound by the very transformations they force on others. Every change they make, every soul they corrupt, feeds the heart's power and tightens their own chains." As if to prove his words, the heart's surface cracked further. Light began to shine from within. Not the cold radiance of the Deep One's power, but something warmer, something that spoke of sun-dappled shallows and the joy of free movement. Bjorn attacked then, his form abandoning any pretense of humanity. He became a writhing mass of tentacles and teeth, scales and spines, every transformation he'd undergone manifesting at once. "The crown!" he howled. "Take the crown before it's too late!" But Eric had seen the truth in the heart's crystalline depths. The crown wasn't meant to channel power. It was meant to bind him to the same chains that held the Deep Ones themselves. Every transformation they offered was really an echo of their own imprisonment, an attempt to spread the bonds that held them to their stolen power. His blade met Bjorn's attack, its runes flaring with transformed joy. Where once it had simply cut transformed flesh, now it severed deeper bonds, the ties that bound Bjorn to the Deep One's will. The transformed ring and scale added their power, aurora light and liberating force combining with the blade's song. Bjorn screamed as the bonds began to break, his flesh flowing like water as transformation warred with transformation. The heart's light grew stronger, its crystal surface webbed with cracks that leaked ancient memory into the night air. "Brother," Eric called, using their old bond to reach through the layers of corruption. "You can choose again. The heart's power doesn't have to be used for bondage. True transformation comes from choice, not force." For a moment, something human flickered in Bjorn's eyes, a recognition of truth, a memory of brotherhood. But then darkness swept it away, and he lunged for the crown with tentacles extended. "The Deep Ones chose me, gave me power. I won't go back to being weak." "Not weakness," Eric said sadly. "Freedom." His blade struck true, not at Bjorn's flesh, but at the heart itself. The transformed ring and scale lent their power to the blow, turning the weapon's edge from mere bone to something that could cut through centuries of corrupted magic. The crystal heart split with a sound like breaking chains, and ancient power swept outward like a tide. Light exploded from the broken heart, warm and free and terrible in its purity. Eric felt the power wash through him, felt it recognize what He done with his transformed artifacts. This was transformation in its truest form, not the forced changes of the deep ones, but the natural evolution of all things in their time. Bjorn howled as the light struck him, his twisted flesh beginning to flow again. But this time, the change was different. Not corruption, but clarification, burning away the layers of forced transformation to reveal what lay beneath. All around the ship, all across the dark waters, the same change swept through the deep. One's servants, the heart's crystal shards began to dissolve, releasing their imprisoned essence back into the world. Through the blood binding, Eric sensed vast forms stirring in the depths, the deep ones themselves, feeling their stolen power slip away. Their ancient sleep was ending, but not in the way they had planned. As the light of true transformation filled the night, Eric stood over his fallen oath brother, watching as power and corruption burned away to reveal what remained of the man he had once called brother. The crown lay forgotten, its power broken with the heart that had fueled it. The time of forced change was ending, but as the heart's last crystal fragments melted away, Eric knew that an even greater transformation was just beginning. The justice blade hung suspended between them, its bone surface now swirling with both darkness and light. The weapon had changed when the heart shattered, transformed by the same pure force that now swept through the fjord. No longer just a tool of vengeance, it had become something more, an arbiter of choice, a key to unlock the chains of forced change. Bjorn lay sprawled on the deck, his flesh still flowing as the heart's released power burned away layers of corruption. The man emerging from that metamorphosis was both familiar and strange, younger somehow, yet marked by every choice that had led him here. His eyes held terror and wonder in equal measure as he watched his transformed flesh slowly return to human form. "What have you done?" he whispered, voice rough with pain and revelation. "What have you done to me?" "Given you back your choice," Eric answered, keeping the blade steady between them. "The Deep One's power is broken. Their chains are falling away. What you become now depends on you." Around them, the night was filled with the sounds of transformation. From the circle of corrupted ships came cries of confusion and liberation, as changed raiders found themselves free of their monstrous bonds. In the waters below, vast shapes thrashed in the depths, the Deep Ones themselves, their stolen power slipping away like water through cupped hands. The transformed ring at Eric's throat pulsed with sympathetic energy, while the scale in his pocket burned with the fire of freedom. Through these artifacts, he could sense the waves of change spreading outward from the broken heart, touching everything that the Deep One's power had corrupted. "Kill me then," Bjorn said, struggling to sit upright. "Finish your revenge. Prove you're stronger than what they offered." This was never about revenge. Eric lowered the blade, letting its transformed power illuminate his former oath brother's face. It was about choice, about showing there's another way to change, to become something more than what we are. "And what are we now?" Bjorn's laugh held equal parts bitterness and wonder as he looked at his hands, human again for the first time in years. "What am I without their power?" Before Eric could answer, movement caught his eye. The crown had fallen near the altar during their battle, and now it began to shine with its own light, not the cold radiance of the Deep One's power, but something older, something that spoke of choices yet unmade. "The crown still holds power," Bjorn said, his voice taking on an eager edge. "We could still—" "Look closer," Eric interrupted. "Look with free eyes." Through the Justice Blade's transformed sight, they both saw the crown for what it truly was, not just a tool of bondage, but a mirror of possibility. In its bone surface swirled images of what each of them could become, paths of transformation both light and dark. "I understand now," Eric said softly, "why they chose us both. You for your hunger for power, me for my resistance to it. They needed both, the willing vessel and the reluctant one, because true transformation requires both the desire to change and the wisdom to question how." The Justice Blade hummed with confirmation, its surface rippling with the same pure power that had been trapped within the heart. That power called to something in Eirik's own soul, offering one final choice: to take up the crown himself, to become something greater than either the Deep Ones or their servants had imagined. For a moment, he let himself feel the full weight of that temptation. The transformed ring and scale joined their voices to the blade's song, showing him visions of what he could become. Not a slave to ancient power, but a master of transformation itself. He could reshape the world, free others from their bonds, become something that even the Deep Ones would fear. "You feel it too," Bjorn said, watching his face. "The possibility. The power that's still there, waiting to be claimed." "Yes." Erik raised the justice blade, studying how its surface reflected the aurora above. "But that's the final test, isn't it? Not just breaking their power, but choosing not to take it for ourselves." With a single fluid motion, he brought the blade down on the crown. The weapon's transformed edge, forged from monster bone and sacrificed joy, and now tempered with liberation's fire, sheared through the ancient artifact like sunlight through fog. The crown's destruction sent one final pulse of power through the night. Erik felt it touch everything the Deep Ones had influenced. Every transformed raider, every bound monster, every dark chain of flesh and spirit. But unlike the heart's release, this power didn't force change. Instead, it offered choice. Bjorn gasped as the power washed through him. His flesh rippled one final time, but now he was the one choosing its shape. For a moment, he held forms both human and monstrous, trying them like ill-fitting clothes. Finally, with what seemed like enormous effort, he chose his original form, the man he had been before the Deep One's touch. "How?" he asked, looking at his human hands with wonder. "How did you resist it? The power, the possibility?" "By remembering what you forgot," Erik answered. "That true strength isn't in the power we wield, but in the choices we make with it." The justice blade's glow began to fade, its purpose fulfilled. The transformed ring and scale grew quiet as well, their power spent in that final act of liberation. Even the Deep One's presence was fading from the fjord's depths, their ancient sleep replaced by something closer to peace. Around them, the night slowly returned to natural darkness. The corrupted ship's crews were fully human again, their transformations ended by choice rather than force. In the waters below, the monsters too were changing, some choosing simpler forms, others choosing to remain as they were, but all free to make that choice for themselves. Erik offered his hand to his former oath brother. "The question isn't what you are without their power," he said quietly. "It's what you choose to become now that you're free to choose." Bjorn stared at the offered hand for a long moment. In his eyes, Erik could see the battle between old hunger and new understanding, between the desire for power and the recognition of what that power had cost him. Finally, slowly, he reached up and clasped Erik's arm in the old warrior's grip. The justice blade hummed one final time, acknowledging that this too was transformation, not of flesh or power, but of the heart that guides all choices. Above them, the aurora painted the sky in colors of change and renewal, while below, the fjord's waters began to run clear of ancient darkness. The time of forced transformation was over. The time of chosen change was just beginning. Spring came. Early to the fjords that year, Erik stood on the shore near Grida's dwelling, turning the dawn stone in his hands. The white rock was marked with runes of his own making, not the binding marks of the Deep Ones, but symbols of choice and transformation freely taken. It served as both reminder and warning of what had been and what could be again. "The waters are quieter now," Grida said, appearing beside him with her usual silence. The old woman seemed both older and younger since that night of liberation, as if she too had been touched by the power of chosen change. "Though not empty." "No," Erik agreed. "Some chose to keep their transformed shapes, but they hunt their own prey now, answer to their own wills." His blade hung at his side, its bone surface no longer glowing with power, but holding a quiet wisdom The joy he'd sacrificed to forge it had been transformed into something deeper, an understanding of change itself, of the price and promise of transformation. The transformed ring and scale had crumbled to dust after that final battle, their purpose fulfilled. But their essence lived on in the dawn stone, reminding him that even the darkest power could be turned to liberation's cause. Word had spread through every port and fishing village of what had happened that night. They spoke of the Bone Blade, hunter who had freed the fjords, who had shown both monsters and men that true power lay not in forcing change, but in choosing it. Some said the Deep Ones still slept in the darkness below, dreaming of their lost empire. Others claimed they had transformed themselves one final time, becoming something that no longer hungered for dominion over others. Bjorn had sailed south, with the spring winds, seeking to make amends for the choices he had made. The years would show whether his transformation was lasting, but Eric had seen truth in his former Oath brother's eyes. Understanding brought a terrible cost. "And you?" Greta asked, studying him with knowing eyes. "What transformation have you chosen?" Eric looked out over the fjord, where he had once been cast away as a coward, where he had learned that true courage often meant choosing not to use the power one possessed. "I choose to remember," he said finally, "to keep the knowledge of what happened here, so that others might understand the difference between change that's forced and change that's freely chosen." The dawn stone caught the morning light, its runes glowing briefly with promise. Somewhere out in the deeper waters, something vast moved beneath the surface, not with menace now, but with the simple joy of being what it had chosen to become. Eric smiled, feeling the spring wind carry away the last shadows of winter. The time of monsters and forced transformation had ended, but the power of choice remained, offering each soul the chance to become what it truly wished to be. The dawn. Stone grew warm in his hands, ready to bear witness to whatever transformations the future might bring.